Before we do, are there any family needs or things that we want to mention to pray for before we dive in? Anything in our normal announcements? Okay, I will lead us in prayer and then we'll dive into Joshua chapter 2. Our Father in heaven, we are so thankful for this wonderful day that you've blessed us with and for your creation and the rain that you've poured down on your earth today. And we're so thankful for the homes and shelters that you've given to us that we can stay in from the weather. And we're thankful for this time that has been set aside for us to gather together and open up your word, help that word to shape our hearts and our minds this evening as we look at a story of your people, and that it would impact the way that we live our lives. And we ask you to continue to be with this church family here, with the many things that we have going on with sickness, and but also with joys of new family members and babies being born and announced. And please be with all of our families here as we seek to grow with one another and grow closer to you. And it's all things we pray in your Son's high and holy name. Amen. All right, Joshua chapter 2. We left off last week talking about covenants with Jesse. I am Jesse's partner in crime, so we'll be kind of switching back and forth throughout this quarter, covering Joshua with you. Chapter 2 is Rahab. It's a story that's got some suspense in it, kind of like a movie scene coming out. It's got some deceit. Promises are given, but ultimately it's a story of faith. Let me make sure I have this clicker on here. So if you're following along with the daily Bible reading, I believe we're starting to hit that here. So you might have some context this evening as we dive in, and if you continue with that, you might even get ahead of Jesse and I as we move through the book of Joshua. But we've timed that perfectly with our study this quarter. If you take a look at chapter 2 in context of the entire book, that's where I would like to start with. So if we actually pick up there in the end of chapter 1, where we kind of left off with Jesse, chapter 1, verse 18, whoever rebels against your commandments and disobeys your words, whatever you command him shall be put to death, only be strong and courageous. And then if we jump over to chapter 3, in verse 1, it says, Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim, and they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. So there's this connection between the end of chapter 1 and beginning of chapter 3 that seems to just continue on with what we would expect. But instead, if you saw, as you read perhaps this week in Joshua, chapter 2 kind of takes this random turn where we start looking into where Joshua sends these spies out. And so they're ready to enter in chapter 1, and then they're ready to cross over the Jordan in chapter 3. And so what I want us to take a look at, what I want us to bring out as we kind of open up this story is this a purposeful turn? And so as we work through this chapter this evening, I would really like for you to be thinking about, why did Joshua devote an entire chapter to Rahab? And then why does the Bible narrative as well devote an entire chapter to this story of Rahab? So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to it, and we'll dive into it together. So if we take a look now at Joshua chapter 2 and these first handful of verses, the chapter starts off kind of jarringly. It gives us a lot right away. Verse 1 there are spies secretly sent to Jericho. They enter Rahab's home, a prostitute. Somehow the king knows in verses 2 to 3 there requests that Rahab release these spies. She famously refuses to do so. And then the gate is shut there at the end of verse 7, and the spies are trapped inside the city of Jericho. And so there's a lot happening in this section, and a lot of questions and things that we could ask. One thing that I really want us to see here is, throughout this first section, is the amount of choices that are being made. So if you look at verse 1, there's this choice that Rahab makes to allow these spies to come into her home. It says they lodged there. Then verses 3 through 5, Rahab, is there, and her dialogue is recorded for us. And what does she do? She lies for these spies. She decides to deceive her countrymen and not let these spies in, or be found, rather, not let the king's men come in and find these spies. And so she chooses to lie for them there. And then verse 6, she chooses to hide the spies there on the roof and ensure their safety by making sure that they're concealed in the flax, as it says there, that's drying on the roof. And so Rahab makes a lot of different choices here. Really, these choices all were around life or death, right? Whether or not these spies were going to live were in Rahab's hands. And surely disobeying the king would have had dire consequences for Rahab. We're not really given more information about that. But really what's being presented to Rahab here is this opportunity to either choose life or death. These spies give her this opportunity to, or really give her an opportunity to go on and receive life. And so she had a choice here. She had a choice to either let these spies into her home to be saved, or to give them up and likely lead them to death. But in doing so, she would also cut off her own opportunity to gain life. And so we see this kind of theme of choice throughout the Bible. Maybe some examples have come to your mind as we've kind of explored this idea in this first section. But things that came to my mind throughout the Bible narrative is very basically Eve, right? Eve had a choice to either partake of the fruit or not partake of the fruit, to gain life or to receive death. Moses, maybe a little bit closer to home to this story, Moses, when he presented the covenant back in Deuteronomy to Israel, that's Deuteronomy 30, he says, "I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction." And so Moses was very clearly outlining, this is a choice you have. You have either the choice to be obedient and choose life, or these rules are also going to lead you to destruction if you do not follow these commandments. And certainly kind of goes back to some of our class last week with the covenants. And so in the same way, what I would really like to pull up from this first section here as we see Rahab make these choices is that we also have this same choice. It's also given to us. We can either choose life or death. We can either become an eternal follower of Jesus, or we can serve the temporary, the here and the now. And Matthew says, or Jesus says in Matthew, when he's talking about entering through the narrow gate, he says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only few find it." And so our choices, they either lead us to life through that narrow passageway, or destruction. And so we have a choice, and I think Rahab's story here, the beginning of Rahab's story, teaches us that, displays that regardless of historical time or place, we're given an opportunity to make this choice. In addition to that, we're seeing in this section where there's this instance where the king of Jericho has sent to Rahab there, and starting in verse 3, and Rahab is clearly making a choice here where her loyalty lies. It does not lie with this king of Jericho, but instead she has chosen a new nation, a new king. And as we'll see as we kind of unpack this chapter, Rahab recognizes God as the true king instead of the king of Jericho. We'll kind of dig into this some more, but essentially she's going to look at the evidence around her and she's going to choose God as king instead of this king of Jericho. And so she was presented also with a choice here of, am I going to follow this nation that is on the path to destruction, or am I going to choose this one true God that has revealed himself to this area? And so she makes that choice here, there in verse 3. And so again, for us, I think it's which king are we going to choose? Who is our king? Where does our loyalty lie as well? And those things impact our choice to choose life or to choose death. Any questions there or for comments from you all on verses 1 through 7? What do you see? Yeah.
I just think it's noteworthy that she is probably not alone in what she saw, but she knew of things that had happened on the other side of the river and how kings had been defeated and people were talking about what was going on. But even we go back 40 years when she brings up that she knows how they crossed the Red Sea when it dried up, and people have been talking about God and his people for a long time.
Yeah.
When they make their presence known, she does the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So kind of moving on to this next section here. They're starting in verse 8. What we start to see unfold throughout this chapter is a conversation that Rahab has. And if you look at this chapter overall, a lot of what we have is this narrative of Rahab speaking and kind of revealing things about this story to us. And so that starts here in verse 8. She comes to the spies on the roof and starts to talk with them. And so the first thing is that she kind of reveals to us that I want to capture from this next section here is in verse 10 is that she had heard of God's works. And so verse 10, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and when you did what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And so all of Canaan has seen or has heard of God's works. God had been working and preparing for this moment for his people to come into this land. And Rahab had heard of as far back the Red Sea event and had also heard of their earlier defeats of these two kings that we see Moses defeat. And so it's this hearing of the word that impacts Rahab. That's what she's telling us here in verse 10. That's what's impacted her, but also her entire nation. And so then what was the result of hearing these works? Well, we see that then in verse 9. I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. And so what was the result of hearing God's works? It was that God was impacting their hearts. All of the inhabitants of Jericho were fearful. So fear fell upon everyone. They melt away, it says there in verse 9, in the face of this invasion. And then what this starts to reveal to us in verse 11 as well, and as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. And so I'm really excited that I got this chapter, because throughout our study of Joshua, there's a theme that this introduces for us that you'll see us come back to multiple times, and that is this hearts melting, this hearts melted theme. So as you read through that in the Bible study or the daily Bible reading and work through that with us, note that. But that's the first time we see this phrase here is in verse 11, and so we'll see that throughout all of Joshua. But it's this fear, let me catch my slides up here, that really impact their hearts. And so, let's see here. So how does this impact Rahab? I think one way that we can start to kind of unpack this theme of hearts melted is kind of looking back at the original spies, which you might have already also been kind of thinking about. Joshua was part of those original spies that were sent out, that got them, of course, into trouble and has delayed them coming into the land. But I think one way that we can kind of reveal how this might have impacted Rahab's heart is to go back and look at that. And so just briefly in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and in verse 28, this same phrase is mentioned as hearts melted. And so Deuteronomy there is summarizing Israel's rebellion, and that's how Deuteronomy describes the impact that the spies' original report had on the Israelites. And so you have the original spies' report that actually brings all of Israel down and melts their hearts and brings them to this self-doubt that they have. And they're not able to really pull themselves back out of that broken faith, and obviously is what brings them into the wilderness. And so now if we contrast that with how does this impact Rahab, though? Well, what we see in Rahab is she actually finds the opposite. She finds conviction and certainty in God's power. So as God is working in this area and through these actions with the Israelites, it's impacting the hearts of this nation, of the nations within Canaan. But the way that Rahab has responded to this is actually with conviction and belief. And so we see that very, prominently, I would say, within this chapter is in verse 9 there. She says, I know that the Lord has given you the land. She's already convinced that they have taken this land and that God is going to carry this out. Verse 11, in the latter half of verse 11, says there, He is God in the heavens and the earth. She makes this confession of faith, of saying that I believe that your God is God, and He is God in the heavens and in the earth. And so Rahab heard of God's works, right? She had heard of the things. Hearing those things melted her heart. And then in response to that, she believed with conviction that God was going to carry out these works, that God is the one true God. And so that's the big thing that I want us to get out of this current section is Rahab's response to these actions of God. So what comments or questions do you all have from verses 8 through 11? Yeah.
I was just thinking that, you brought out that she just heard these things and has this amazing belief versus the people that came out of Egypt saw God's works
That's
and
good.
still didn't have any faith.
Yes.
don't have the faith that he requires of us. So
Absolutely.
it's really awesome and beautiful.
Yeah, I like that a lot, seeing versus hearing. Yeah. Jay?
And one of the things also related to Rahab, one of the things I read I thought was kind of interesting, where the seed promise of Abraham, and he was, someone considered, well off in the social stratosphere, and she's on the low end of that, but God will work through various people to accomplish his goals. So much so that strategically, where she was located, where her house was located, was along the walls. So it was good for them. Also, where there are various, let's say, individuals kind of in and out of that house. So maybe it wasn't as noticeable, although the king did take note, but she was still believable enough to lie about it that he willingly believed her immediately. So also that says something about her. She was probably trusted, at
Right.
least. So I think that that's all interesting. And then ultimately we know as well through Joseph, if you read in Matthew, the lineage of Christ.
Yes.
So she also becomes part of the promise. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's fair to say, by her faith and action. Like, I did something for you, and can immediately boldly say, do something for me, save me.
Yeah.
Save me and my family.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens.
Yeah. I think that's awesome, Ryan. So, yeah. Oh. Kevin?
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. I mean, that they still are recalling the crossing of the Red Sea, something that happened
Yeah.
over 40 years ago.
Right.
And it is still, it's amazing how the original spies and their fear and kind of dread and things like that, but the people of the land have been like looking and seeing and anticipating this for a long, long time. And Rahab is like, hey, I'm on board. Like, I see that instead of going with the king that I know and the things I know, I'm allying myself with this greater power that I can see coming.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It just speaks to God's influence in the area for a long period of time. And we'll explore that later in likely another chapter. Oh, yeah, Josh. Sorry.
I love the contrast that you made there from Deuteronomy 1. The hearts melted for different reasons, right? So in Deuteronomy 1, it was what they could not do.
Mm-hmm.
And with these people here, it was what they knew God was going to do.
Yeah.
And certainly where we put the emphasis in our lives is important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, great. So if we keep moving through the chapter here, we'll kind of pick up in verse 12. And so in verse 12, Rahab's conversation continues, but it takes a little bit of a different turn now. Based on this confessed faith in God, she starts to take action here. So verses 12 through 13, Rahab seeks God's salvation. And not only for herself, but also for her entire family. So she petitions the spies there to take an oath, to promise to her. And so she starts to outline this oath that she wants them to take. And so through this next conversation, I think we see even further this active faith where Rahab is given an opportunity to take action here even further than what we've already seen her take action with the choices that she made. But I think this is one reason why she's mentioned in James chapter 2. So if you want to turn over to James chapter 2, where Rahab is mentioned as James tackles this same topic of faith. And I'll just read a couple of verses tonight. Obviously, this whole section is great application, but James chapter 2 and starting in verse 24 says, "You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead." So how does the story of Rahab connect with James 2, kind of based on what we've discussed so far and then what we just read in James 2? Feel free to take from other places from James 2 as well that you see there. But how does the story of Rahab connect? Why does he bring up Rahab? Yeah.
I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but, I mean, she could have turned them away and said, okay, I'm not gonna say you're here, but I'm not gonna house you, or I'm not gonna hide you. So her taking that extra step really convicted, or showed her conviction to the cause.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
She was putting her life on the line. I mean, it was
Right.
all- You know, I understand we're talking about eternity here, but in the present moment, if she was found out, like her physical human life, she was going to lose it. So
Right.
it would be easy to not have that much faith to put your life on the line.
Yeah. No, I think both of those for sure. I think what's said in like verse 22 of James chapter 2, you see that faith was active along with his works. The same thing that's said there of Abraham, and that faith was completed by his works. I think that's what we see take place here as well, is that Rahab took action alongside her faith. And James mentions there, when he mentions her in verse 25, that she received the messengers. And so, yeah, I think that's exactly it as well. Of she didn't just ignore them; she took them in and helped them. And if she hadn't done that, would she have been saved? Or what's going to be Israel's commandment? Complete destruction of this area. And so we see that she has an act of faith because she's ready to respond to this opportunity. This is an opportunity to make this confessed faith and to take action. And she was ready for it. She was ready to take that opportunity. And so this wasn't an expectation that it wasn't scheduled on her planner that these spies were going to come in and that she was going to be able to find salvation. Maybe she had thought that when the Israelites invaded, she would be able to come to them. But again, I'm not sure that would have been the case, right? Because they're commanded to take Jericho in completion and devote it to complete destruction. And so this was her opportunity, and if she had passed on it, she would have not received salvation. And so I think in the same way that she works through this faith, we also are required to have an act of faith. And oftentimes opportunities present themselves to us, and I'm sure you all have had similar experiences where you look back at an opportunity to either have a confession of faith to someone else who may not be inclined, or to talk to a friend, and then that opportunity is passed over, and you don't get to go back in time and have that. And so I think in the same ways we could see how this is dire, to take these opportunities and to act on them. And so I think of things like Galatians 6:10 as well. As we have opportunity, let us do good to all. And we already kind of looked at that, but James chapter 2 and 24, you see that a person is justified by works and not faith alone. And so just kind of doing a time check here, I kind of want to move forward just briefly and cover one more topic, and then we can kind of dive into some more comments. But as we also move through this section, we see that there's this covenant, or this oath that they enter in on. And with this act of faith that she has, this covenant that the spies and Rahab build together has some very interesting properties to it, or attributes to it, right? In verse 15, there Rahab tells them how to avoid being found. And so they've got to follow that instruction in order not to be found. And then in verse 18, the spies tell her how to save her entire family. These are the instructions. These are the things that you need to do. And so there are conditions, there are rules tied to this exchange. The scarlet cord for Rahab, there are these rules where she's got to have the scarlet cord needs to be tied in the window in verse 18. Her family must stay inside. They don't be going out into the street. Don't be going out and trying to escape. You need to stay inside. There's also this sense of, Rahab, you better not spill the beans that we've been here and get us caught there in verse 20. But if you tell this business of ours, then we shall be guiltless with respect to your oath that you have made us swear. And so there's these conditions and rules that Rahab needs to abide by. But the spies also have some conditions too. She tells them there in verse 15 that they need to stay hidden for 3 days. Like, if you do it for 3 days, they're going to pass back through and you're going to be safe. And that's also self-serving a little bit as well. But they need to follow that, because if they do get found out, they might not make it back to tell them about her covenant with them. And they might also just assume that Rahab broke their covenant and ratted them out. And so each group has these conditions that they need to obey. And I think that's why I really want to cover this tonight as well. That's why Rahab is mentioned in Hebrews 11. So if you just turn probably just a handful of pages back from James, if you're still there, in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 31, Hebrews 11:31 says, "By faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies." So some similar elements there between Hebrews and the James passage. But Rahab, or the writer of Hebrews really compares Rahab to those who are disobedient and those who are obedient. And so he says there that she did not perish because those that were disobedient. So that kind of implies that Rahab was obedient. And so what are some ways that Rahab shows this obedience? I think we see that here in this covenant that she makes with the spies. There in verse 21, Jesse and I were talking about this, and Jesse mentioned she, in verse 21 of Joshua, how quickly does she tie that scarlet cord? Immediately as they depart. She's gone and started to follow these instructions. Across those 3 days, like we've already talked about, across those 3 days, the spies are out there hiding in the hills. Does she have self-doubt like those original spies? Does she start thinking, well, maybe I can turn those spies in for some protection from Jericho? Do I think that maybe Jericho could actually protect my family during this invasion if I could exchange these spies in? But instead, Rahab stays obedient to the covenant that she had made with these spies, and the spies are not found. And I think that's what we see later there in verse 22. Just kind of think through this chapter. Why does verse 22 exist? It says there, they departed and went into the hills and remained there 3 days until the pursuers returned. And the pursuers searched all along the way and found nothing. So again, because Rahab, she held up her end of the covenant. They made it back safely and fully trusted. And then kind of a spoiler alert here, but we'll see later that Rahab holds on to her faith all the way until the end of the destruction of Jericho, and so she's obedient. She's an obedient servant at this point, and so I think for us, what can we say that of our faith as well? Am I going to stay obedient and faithful until the very end? That's how when Jesus is talking about the parable of the talents there in Matthew 25, he says there, "Well done, good and faithful servant," to the good servants, good and faithful servant. And I thought of that as I moved through this, that Rahab, and I think that's what the Hebrews writer pulls out here, was faithful until the very end, until this covenant basically is brought to completion. And Jericho falls and she is saved. So any comments? I know I've been talking for a while now. Comments or questions for I'd say verses 12 through 24.
I think it's interesting. that,
Go ahead, Dave.
I've heard it said some different times where people should not come to conversion through fear. But I think fear of God.
Hmm.
I think this demonstrates that fear is kind of a starting point of recognizing who God is. And yes, as created beings, it is a fearful thing to look at the Creator and see what He's done. And she was afraid, but it doesn't have to stop there. You know, she went ahead and believed and acted upon it.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. Jay?
I was thinking about the scarlet cord.
Hmm.
Thinking about the rope and what that may mean. And I thought it might be pushing it to say, you know, is it a sort of almost admitting sin and need of salvation? And I think it could, if you look at Isaiah 1:18, though your sins be as scarlet, and they will be as white as snow. God will make it white as snow. You know, a song from a song of mine. It's from the Bible, but we
Yeah.
sing it in a song. So I was thinking about that as well. And there's like it almost seems like there's this intentional, I am admitting to sin through this red, you know, that symbol of red and blood. And even later it says, like the instructions that are told, if anyone goes out from the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head. So
Mhm.
there's reference to blood that's going to happen. So
Yeah.
instead, you know, here's my, you know, I'm saying, yes, I will obey, I will follow the instructions that
Right.
I've been given, so that I can have that salvation.
Hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. There's just kind of through your comment there. There's lots of symbolism, I think, in this chapter, and it was definitely hard to decide what to talk about this evening because there's so many different pathways and things like that. Especially with the scarlet cord. I remember one point that that I looked into a little bit as well. That was, you know, how does that maybe even connect to the Passover of, you know, for her in a sense of this salvation, this oncoming destruction that's going to wipe out everyone else, but her and her family. So, but there's lots of things like that that are lots of paths that to go down like that. Yeah, Dave again. Yeah.
I think it's interesting, the Hebrews 11:31, how God describes what we would see on the surface as, well, she lied to
Mhm.
protect the spies and preserve their life. But God describes it as He gave them a friendly welcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought that was interesting as God writes this.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful too that you know, not to use that too much to discount. I agree with you, but like also the that she did lie, and I think that these James and the Hebrew writer both, I think, focus on her faith and her obedience, but don't necessarily discount her the fact that she did lie and not necessarily think that that's right. That's on the other hand. I feel like I missed. John.
Piggyback off what Dave's first comment was, and you said opportunity, and that made me really think about it, like, Rahab knew the outcome of the situation, which is what we need to bring ourselves to and will to, is understanding the outcome of our situation, which is sin is separating us from God.
Yeah.
And so Rahab saw that, and you said, oh, here's a way out. And we have to be able to see the way out and lead people to the way out, which is Jesus.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. Yeah.
I think building off of Dave's second comment, I think one of my favorite ways to read through the Old Testament is to see it as kind of a handbook for how the Jews can survive being a diaspora population. And so over and over again we see this Hezekiah, you know, Mordecai, all these examples of Jews being in position to help the Jewish people in when they're outside of the promised land. And I think Rahab here, with her lie, is another example of that, of the preferential treatment of God's people and how that's a good thing when counted to someone as faith. And so, in the New Testament, how we can apply that is the preferential treatment of our brethren in the face of what would be considered dishonor in our culture. Obviously, Rahab lying to her own people to protect someone who's not traditionally her people, that's a huge sense of dishonor. And so in a modern sense, what are we willing to go against? What modern customs are we willing to go against to show preferential treatment to our brothers and sisters?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like that point a lot. It's makes me think back to like the fact that she basically disregards her nation, and I think you're kind of saying kind of disregard culture in a sense.
Are we
Yeah.
willing to disregard our family for our brothers?
Right. Right. Yeah. All right. So I do want to get back to those questions I asked at the beginning as we kind of wrap up. Why did Joshua devote an entire chapter to Rahab? Why does the Bible kind of devote an entire chapter to Rahab? And you don't have to answer these individually. You can answer them together. Whatever thoughts have kind of come to your mind as we've dived into this.
Well,
Yeah.
obviously, it's not the reason to try to figure out, well, did she lie or did she not, or anything like that. That's God's end of the stick. And we
Right.
leave God with it. And obviously, it does not give us a license to lie or anything like that. But it does give us a license to be faithful unto death.
Mm-hmm.
Protect the people of God. Care for the future of your own family. Understand that God is the most powerful, supreme God.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Rob.
So I think if we were Jewish, or if we were, especially if we were Jewish 2,000 years ago, we'd probably understand the answer to your question a lot better. I think we could try to appreciate, but probably not enough, how important lineage was to the Jews, to be able to trace their lineage back to Abraham. It's so important, in fact, that we have Jesus's lineage, from both sides, even though we know Joseph had nothing to do with it. We have, Joseph in Matthew and Mary in Luke, or vice versa. I forget which is which. But we have Jesus's lineage recorded for us, and there in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 5, we have Rahab listed. Rahab is part of Jesus's lineage. Now, from other things that are said in the New Testament being written to contemporary people, and Rahab is mentioned. You brought up the verses in Hebrews and elsewhere, James,
Mm-hmm.
so that I don't think that reference was over their head. They knew who Rahab was. So I think it's important that they understand, or they understood why, who Rahab was, why she's in the lineage, even though she's not a Jew. Weren't they commanded not to marry the peoples of the land? And all of these things, I think it was probably pretty important to the Jews to have some statement of who Rahab was and what she did. And the last thing, I'm sorry for being so long-winded, the last thing I'll say is, I think it makes a very similar point that the verse, it escapes me where it is, where it asks the rhetorical question, was Abraham counted righteous, before the law was given or after the law was given? Right? It was accounted to Abraham righteousness before the law was ever given. And he wasn't of the Mosaical law, and yet it was accounted to him as righteousness. I think it's a similar point that Rahab, who was not a Jew, who nevertheless believed and had faith and backed up that faith with her works, which is the point that you made tonight real well. I think it's important that they understand that. It's a similar point to Abraham being accounted to Abraham righteousness.
Yeah. No, those are all really good points, Rob. Yeah, I think like many of you, I think the big thing, especially because we see Hebrews and James, is Rahab's faith. And overall Bible narrative is, I think, the key thing to get from Rahab's story is this picture of faith. And so just in conclusion, that is the big picture here that I think we see as a recipe for faith through Rahab is that she hit all of these things and is what brought her to faith in God. And so that's what I'll leave you with this evening. Thank you very much for your comments and for looking at this. You'll have a break from me, and Jesse will pick up next week. I think we're looking at chapters 3 and 4 next week. So we're not just going chapter to chapter. We'll be covering 2 chapters next week, chapters 3 and 4.
Good evening, family. We're going to sing number 667, In Heavenly Love Abiding. Oh, so in heavenly love abiding, no change my heart shall fear, and safe is such confiding, for nothing changes here. The storm may roar without me, my after the invitation psalm will be number 777, Jesus Saves.
Good evening. If you'd like to follow along with me, our invitation for tonight will be from the book of John. Our first passage will be John 20:24. Oftentimes, whenever we encounter trials, our faith can grow weak. There are many, many examples of this throughout the Bible, but tonight I'd like to take a look at Thomas. John 20:24. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." Oftentimes, we tend to look down on Thomas because he was with Jesus and yet didn't believe that he would rise from the dead. However, we often tend to forget that Thomas was a very, very zealous man and was supposedly ready to die with Jesus. Please turn with me to John 11:14. John 11:14. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." How could a man who seemed so ready to die with Jesus abandon him just a few days later? To be fair to Thomas, he had just abandoned his teacher in the Garden of Gethsemane, at which point the full weight of Jewish law used the power of the strongest empire in the world at that time to crucify him and hunt down the disciples in an effort to put them to death as well. On the evening of the fourth day after Jesus' death, the disciples had all gathered to pray together. Thomas wasn't there. We don't know why he wasn't there. We don't know what he was doing instead. We just know he wasn't there. Because he was not with them, being strengthened by them, his faith grew weak. When the other disciples told him that Jesus had returned, he didn't believe them. It took Jesus appearing to Thomas personally to reawaken his faith. If we ever see Jesus face to face, it will be too late to believe in him. We must believe without seeing. But Jesus himself says in John 20:29, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." If you are ready tonight to confess Jesus as your King and be baptized for the remission of your sins, please come forward as we stand and sing.